What happens when a mother's quiet day at the airport turns into a battle against an entire system of injustice? Follow the gripping journey of Gabrielle Turner as she takes on a powerful corporation to fight for her daughter, her dignity, and a future where equality isn't just a promise, it's a reality. One moment sparked a revolution, and it's only just begun. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The Sunday morning air inside Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport hummed with the sounds of boarding calls, the low hum of luggage wheels on tile floors, and the occasional chatter of travelers. Beyond the bustling main terminal, the VIP lounge exuded a contrasting calm. Large windows framed a view of the runway, where planes taxied under the golden light of summer. Inside, the leather seats were arranged in neat clusters, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. A polished wooden bar lined one side of the room, staffed by a barista crafting espresso drinks with the precision of a master artisan. Overhead, a flat-screen television silently displayed a news broadcast, captions scrolling below a confident anchor discussing recent high-profile cases of racial discrimination. The words civil rights and court victory flashed on the screen, drawing scattered glances from the lounge's occupants. Gabrielle Turner sat near the window with her 7-year-old daughter, Lila, who was perched on the edge of her seat, swinging her legs as she flipped through her sketchbook. Gabrielle's appearance was a study in understated elegance. A tailored navy blue suit paired with modest silver earrings. Her dark curls were pinned back neatly, and her sharp eyes reflected a combination of exhaustion and determination. She had just wrapped up a grueling legal battle, a landmark case that had set a new precedent in civil rights law. For weeks, her name had dominated headlines, earning her both praise and criticism. Gabrielle's calm demeanor belied the storm she knew was brewing. Being one of the most prominent black female attorneys in the country came with its own set of challenges, ones she had grown adept at navigating. "Mom, look!" Lila held up a fresh sketch of the lounge's coffee bar, complete with tiny cups and steam curling upward. Gabrielle glanced over, her lips curving into a small smile. "That's great, sweetheart. You captured the barista perfectly." A man seated nearby, flipping through a business magazine, leaned over slightly. "Excuse me," he said, his southern drawl subtle but noticeable. "Are you Gabrielle Turner, the attorney from the Simmons case?" Gabrielle hesitated briefly before nodding. "Yes, that's me." The man straightened, offering a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Impressive work, though I imagine not everyone's happy about it." She met his gaze steadily. "Justice rarely makes everyone happy, but it's necessary." Before the man could respond, Lila accidentally bumped a cup of water on the low table in front of her. The glass tipped, spilling its contents across the polished wood and onto the floor. "Oh no!" Lila exclaimed, jumping back and clutching her sketchbook to her chest. The sound drew the attention of several other travelers, their glances ranging from mildly annoyed to openly judgmental. Gabrielle reached for a stack of napkins from the table, her expression composed. "Sorry about that," she said calmly, dabbing at the water with one hand while reassuring Lila with the other. Before Gabrielle could act further, a shadow loomed over the table. She looked up to see a woman in a meticulously pressed uniform standing rigidly before her. Linda Parker, a middle-aged flight attendant with sharp, hawkish features and an air of unchecked authority, fixed her eyes on the spill with a scowl that seemed to suck the air from the room. "Unbelievable," Linda hissed, her voice cutting through the subdued hum of the lounge. "This is a VIP lounge, not a daycare center." Gabrielle blinked, momentarily taken aback by the hostility. She slowly rose from her seat, napkin still clutched in her hand. "Excuse me?" Linda's lips curled into a disdainful sneer as she gestured toward the spreading pool of water. "You need to teach your child how to behave in places like this. People come here to relax, not to deal with this." Her words dripped with contempt as she waved dismissively at Lila, whose wide, fearful eyes darted to her mother. "I didn't mean to," Lila stammered, her voice trembling and barely audible. Gabrielle instinctively placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, her protective instincts flaring. "It was an accident," she said firmly, her tone steady, "and I'm cleaning it up." But Linda wasn't satisfied. She scoffed, folding her arms as her gaze bore into Gabrielle. Accidents like this don't just happen. Maybe if you taught her some manners, this wouldn't be an issue. Honestly, she shouldn't even be in here if she can't control herself. Lila flinched at the venom in Linda's words, her small frame seeming to shrink under the weight of the scrutiny. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "I'm sorry." Gabrielle's grip on her daughter tightened, her jaw clenching as she fought to keep her composure. "That's enough," she said, her voice cold and measured. "You've made your point, and it's inappropriate. Back off." Linda's smirk widened, her condescension growing sharper with each passing second. "Back off! No, I'm just doing my job. This lounge has standards. Clearly, not everyone here meets them." Gabrielle took a step forward, her tone hardening. "You will not speak to my daughter like that." Linda leaned down toward Lila, her face just inches away from the child's tear-streaked cheeks. "Listen, little girl," she sneered, her voice lowering to a chilling whisper. "When you're in places like this, you don't get to make mistakes. People like you—" Then it happened. Linda's hand moved in a quick, deliberate arc, striking Lila's cheek with a sharp slap that echoed through the lounge. Lila gasped audibly, stumbling back as her sketchbook slipped from her hands and landed on the floor with a hollow thud. A few pages fluttered open, exposing the intricate sketches of coffee cups and bar counters she had so carefully drawn earlier. The room fell into an icy silence. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause in shock. Lila raised a trembling hand to her reddened cheek, her tears now spilling freely as she looked up at her mother. Gabrielle's entire body stiffened, her hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Slowly, deliberately, she straightened to her full height, her eyes locking onto Linda with a fury that burned cold. "That," Gabrielle said, her voice low and cutting, "was your last mistake." Linda straightened, her own expression momentarily faltering before she regained her defensive stance. "Don't be dramatic. It was just a tap. Maybe now she'll learn some discipline, since it's clearly lacking at home." Gabrielle moved to stand between Linda and Lila, her presence radiating authority. "You just struck my daughter in front of an entire room of witnesses," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "You owe her an apology. Now." Linda scoffed, though her posture betrayed a flicker of unease. "Oh, please, don't act like this is some kind of assault. People like you are always looking for an excuse to make a scene." The murmurs in the lounge grew louder. A man seated nearby whispered urgently to his companion, while a young woman across the room raised her phone, the camera angled directly at the unfolding confrontation. "Apologize," Gabrielle said again, her voice firm and unwavering. Linda tilted her head, her smirk returning with a venomous edge. "Apologize? To her? People like you don't belong in spaces like this. You may have a pass to get in, but that doesn't mean you fit in." Gabrielle stepped closer, her gaze unflinching. "Let me make one thing very clear. My daughter belongs wherever I do, and you just crossed a line you can't come back from." Hers eyes followed Linda as the flight attendant stormed off toward the staff area, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. Turning back to Lila, she squeezed her daughter's hand gently. She sat on the leather sofa, her arm wrapped protectively around Lila, who still clutched her sketchbook. The room around them, once an oasis of calm, now felt cold and suffocating. Lila's eyes were red, her small fingers gripping the edges of her book so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Mom," Lila whispered, her voice trembling as she looked up. "Did I do something wrong? Is it my fault?" Gabrielle's heart clenched. The weight of those words hit her harder than any courtroom argument ever could. "No, sweetheart," she said, brushing a tear from Lila's cheek. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people act badly because of their own problems. It has nothing to do with you." "But she was so mad at me," Lila murmured, her voice barely audible. "Why do they hate us?" Gabrielle inhaled sharply, struggling to find the right words. The question hung in the air like a heavy fog, pressing down on her. She had spent years fighting for justice, confronting discrimination head-on in courtrooms across the country. Yet here she was, unable to shield her daughter from the very thing she had dedicated her life to combating. "It's not hate, baby," she said finally, though she knew it wasn't entirely true. "It's ignorance. and ignorance can make people act in ways that hurt others. But it's not your job to fix that. It's mine. Lila nodded slowly, but the doubt in her eyes lingered. Gabrielle felt a pang of guilt as she realized how much Lila had already absorbed about the unfairness of the world. As Gabrielle's thoughts churned, Amelia Carter approached with cautious steps. The lounge manager held a polite, practiced smile, but the tension in her posture betrayed her unease. She stopped a few feet away, holding her hands clasped in front of her. "Ms. Turner," Amelia began, her voice smooth but firm, "I want to apologize for the situation earlier. On behalf of the airline, we regret any inconvenience caused." Gabrielle looked up, her eyes narrowing. "An inconvenience?" she repeated, her tone sharp. "Your employee not only humiliated my daughter in front of a room full of people, but also went as far as to slap her, a child, across the face. That's far more than just an inconvenience. It's an outright act of cruelty." Amelia hesitated, then nodded slightly. "I understand. I've spoken to Miss Parker, and we're handling it internally. I can assure you this won't happen again." "That's not enough," Gabrielle replied, keeping her voice steady but firm. "Your employee's behavior was discriminatory, and it needs to be addressed appropriately. I want an apology, not just from you, but from her." Amelia shifted uncomfortably. "I understand your frustration, Ms. Turner. I'll see what I can do." Before Gabrielle could respond, a man seated a few rows away stood up and walked toward her. He appeared to be in his late 40s, with sharp features and a purposeful gait. He carried a notebook and a pen, which he flipped open as he approached. "Ms. Turner," he said, his voice low but direct, "I'm Michael Hayes. I couldn't help but overhear. Are you willing to share more about what just happened? I think this is something people need to know about." Gabrielle studied him for a moment, assessing his intentions. His demeanor was calm but intense, and there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes that felt genuine. "Are you a journalist?" she asked. "I am," Michael admitted, holding up his notebook. "I cover civil rights issues, and it seems to me that what just happened here is part of a much larger problem." Gabrielle hesitated. She didn't trust journalists easily, having seen how stories could be twisted and sensationalized. But something about Michael's straightforwardness gave her pause. "I'm not sure I want to discuss this right now," she said carefully. Michael nodded, slipping his notebook into his jacket pocket. "I understand, but if you change your mind, here's my card." He handed it to her, then stepped back. Moments later, the quiet hum of the lounge was interrupted by a soft chime. A passenger near the bar muttered, "Oh my God," holding their phone up to show the screen to someone next to them. "What is it?" another asked. "A video. It's already online." Gabrielle's stomach sank. She turned to see the passenger playing the video, a shaky recording of Linda's confrontation with her and Lila. The video had clearly been uploaded to social media, complete with captions condemning Linda's behavior. "This is going viral," the passenger murmured. Amelia's face paled as she noticed the growing attention. "Oh no," she muttered under her breath. Gabrielle exhaled slowly, her mind racing. The public scrutiny would bring its own challenges, but it also presented an opportunity. Across the lounge, Linda reappeared, her expression tight. She glanced toward Gabrielle and Lila, then at the passengers watching the video. A flicker of panic crossed her face before she quickly masked it with indignation. "I hope you're satisfied," Linda said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Your little stunt is causing quite a scene." Gabrielle stood, her posture steady and commanding. "This isn't a stunt," she said calmly. "This is accountability. And if you think this is over, you're wrong." Linda scoffed but didn't respond, turning sharply and retreating once more. Gabrielle sat back down beside Lila, wrapping her arm around her daughter. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, more to herself than to Lila, but deep down she knew this was only the beginning. Amelia Carter stood at the edge of the lounge, her phone pressed to her ear as her eyes scanned the room nervously. The stern voice of her supervisor came through the line, sharp and unyielding. "This needs to be handled immediately, Amelia. We can't afford a PR disaster," the voice commanded. "I'm doing my best," Amelia replied, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "But this isn't just going to go away." Her supervisor sighed audibly. "Then make it go away. Apologize, comp the customer, and get everyone to move on." That's what you're here for. Amelia hung up without responding, her jaw tightening as she slipped the phone into her pocket. She took a deep breath, straightened her blazer, and walked back toward Gabriel, who was seated with Lila. Ms. Turner, Amelia began, her tone as measured as she could make it. I understand you're upset, and rightfully so. I'd like to extend our sincerest apologies on behalf of the airline. We'll ensure this matter is addressed internally. Gabrielle looked up from where she sat, her hand resting gently on Lila's shoulder. And what does internally mean exactly, Ms. Carter? Amelia hesitated. She'd handled countless complaints during her years as a lounge manager, but something about Gabrielle's steady gaze made her feel as though she were the one on trial. It means disciplinary action will be taken, Amelia said carefully, but I can't disclose the specifics. That's not good enough, Gabrielle replied, her voice calm but resolute. This isn't just a matter of discipline. It's about addressing a systemic issue. If you think I'm going to let this slide, you're mistaken. Amelia hesitated again, glancing around the room. A few passengers were still stealing glances in their direction, some whispering among themselves. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. I've seen this kind of thing before, she admitted, her tone softer now. It happens more often than you'd think. People who don't look or act the way others expect, they get treated differently. It's not right, but I'm just one person. What am I supposed to do? Gabrielle studied Amelia for a moment. There was a vulnerability in her words, a crack in the polished facade of a professional simply doing her job. You speak up, Gabrielle said firmly. That's what you do, because staying silent only enables it. Amelia nodded slowly, though the uncertainty in her eyes remained. I'll do what I can, she said before stepping away, clearly unsure of how to navigate the precarious position she now found herself in. As Amelia retreated, Michael Hayes reappeared, his notebook now in hand. He approached Gabrielle with a cautious but determined expression. Ms. Turner, he began, glancing briefly at Lila, I wanted to follow up. That video is gaining traction online. People are already talking about it. Gabrielle sighed. I figured as much. This isn't my first time dealing with public scrutiny, Mr. Hayes. Michael chuckled dryly. I can imagine. But this situation is different. It's personal, and people are paying attention. If you're willing, I'd like to help you tell your side of the story. And why would you want to do that? Gabrielle asked, her tone cautious. Because I've seen this happen too many times, Michael replied. I've written about cases like this before. People being mistreated, overlooked, or outright discriminated against. But every time I get close to exposing the truth, I face pushback. Threats, lawsuits, you name it. The thing is, I think you're the kind of person who can take this further than anyone else has. Gabrielle studied him for a moment, her skepticism softening slightly. I'm not interested in making this about me, she said. This is about something much bigger. Exactly, Michael said, a small smile playing on his lips, which is why people need to hear it. Before Gabrielle could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw the name of a colleague from her law firm. Stepping a few paces away, she answered. Gabrielle, her colleague began, his tone urgent. I saw the video. It's everywhere. Listen, I need to warn you, if you push this too far, you're going to stir up some powerful enemies. The airline industry has deep pockets and connections. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves. Gabrielle's grip on the phone tightened. I'm not afraid of them, she said firmly. You should be careful, he cautioned. This could get messy, for you and your daughter. Gabrielle ended the call without replying, her mind racing. The warning wasn't unexpected, but it added a layer of weight to an already fraught situation. She turned back to Michael, who was waiting expectantly. Are you serious about helping me? She asked. Absolutely, Michael replied without hesitation. Then let's make this public, Gabrielle said. I want a press conference today, right here at the airport. If they think they can silence me, they're in for a surprise. Michael's eyes lit up with a mixture of excitement and respect. I'll get it set up. As he walked away, Gabrielle looked down at Lila, who was watching her with a mixture of confusion and admiration. What are you going to do, Mom? Lila asked softly. Gabrielle knelt down so she was eye level with her daughter. I'm going to make sure they understand that what happened here wasn't right, and I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Lila nodded. a flicker of determination mirroring her mother's. Gabrielle stood, her shoulders squared as she prepared for the battle ahead. The press conference was set. Gabriel stood at the podium in the center of the bustling airport terminal, flanked by Michael Hayes and a few of his colleagues from the press. The room was filled with reporters, cameras, and onlookers. Some were merely curious, while others already seemed to know the story. They were waiting, eager for her to speak. Gabriel had never been one to shy away from the spotlight, but today was different. This wasn't about a courtroom or an argument over legal terminology. This was about a personal injustice, a moment when her daughter had been humiliated, and Gabrielle had to make sure it was known that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was bigger. She cleared her throat and began, her voice firm but calm. Thank you all for being here today. I'm Gabriel Turner, and I've been asked to speak on behalf of my daughter, Lila, and every other person who has been treated unfairly because of their race or background. What happened here at this airport, in this lounge, was not just a simple misunderstanding or an isolated incident. This was an act of discrimination. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Gabrielle's eyes swept across the room, locking with the gaze of a few reporters who had already heard the story and others who looked uncertain. She continued, "This isn't about one person's mistake. This is about the way we, as a society, allow people to be treated based on the color of their skin, their appearance, or their background. And that's something I can't let go." The cameras flashed, capturing her every word. She felt the heat of their gaze, but it only fueled her resolve. I'm here not just as a mother, but as an attorney. I've spent my career fighting for justice, but nothing prepared me for the way my daughter was treated today. Gabrielle paused, taking a moment to steady herself. She could see the reporters scribbling notes, the wheels turning in their heads as they tried to process what she was saying. Just as she was about to speak again, a voice interrupted from behind her. "This is ridiculous." Linda Parker stood at the back of the room, her arms crossed and her expression sour. She stepped forward, her presence commanding attention. "I don't know what kind of circus this is, but let me make something clear," Linda said, her voice sharp and defensive. "I was just doing my job. I had to keep the peace in that lounge, and the behavior I witnessed was not acceptable. Gabrielle Turner is making this into something it's not." Gabrielle's eyes narrowed, and she spoke without hesitation. "What I'm making into something it's not, Miss Parker, is your assumption that you have the right to speak to my daughter like that in front of a room full of people. You don't get to treat anyone like that, especially not a child, and expect it to be ignored." Linda scoffed, throwing her hands up in the air. "You're just blowing this out of proportion. What I did was part of my duties. You're the one turning this into a media spectacle for attention." Michael Hayes stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with an edge. "The media didn't create this situation, Ms. Parker. Your actions did." The room grew tense as Linda's face reddened with anger. She had expected things to go differently, her words, her explanation, but the attention now turned toward Gabrielle was far from what she anticipated. Linda quickly turned and walked out of the room, clearly frustrated and unable to offer a defense in front of the cameras. Gabrielle's gaze followed her, but she didn't let herself falter. She turned back to the reporters. "This is about more than just one incident. This is about a system where certain people are deemed less worthy of basic human decency. I'm not going to let it stand any longer." The room buzzed with activity, the reporters hurriedly typing, and the cameras still flashing as Gabrielle's words echoed. But as Gabrielle stood tall, a wave of uncertainty hit her. She had just gone public with everything, and she knew the pressure was only beginning to mount. Later that day, the airline issued a statement. It was brief, filled with corporate language designed to smooth things over without acknowledging the full scope of the problem. "We are currently investigating the incident and ask that Ms. Turner refrain from making further public statements while the matter is under review," the statement read. Gabrielle read it over, the coldness of the words settling in her chest like ice. She could feel the weight of their power, how they tried to silence her, to trivialize what had happened. It was clear now. They wanted her to stop talking. They wanted her to go away. But Gabrielle wasn't backing down. She had been in this fight too long to let a company's PR machine bury the truth. The media began to divide. Some outlets stood firmly by Gabriel, calling out the blatant discrimination. Others, however, took the airline's side, suggesting that Gabriel was using the incident to further her own agenda. She could feel the tension building. There was a new enemy now: public opinion. Amelia Carter, the lounge manager, had sent Gabriel a message later that afternoon. In it, she shared some troubling news. "I've seen this kind of behavior before with Linda," she wrote. "She's always had this attitude, but I was too afraid to speak up. I never thought it would get this far." Amelia had attached a few documents to the message, internal complaints filed against Linda over the years, detailing similar incidents in the past. Gabrielle's heart sank as she read through them. Amelia was taking a risk by passing on this information. If it was discovered, she could lose her job. But Gabrielle couldn't ignore it. Amelia's actions had just opened another door. Gabrielle knew this wasn't just about one incident. It was about changing the way things were done, making sure people like Linda would no longer be allowed to hide behind their uniforms. She sat back, staring at the documents on her screen, already making plans. The fight was far from over, but Gabrielle was ready for the battle ahead. The decision came to Gabrielle in the quiet hours of the night, long after Lila had fallen asleep. The airport incident was no longer just a flashpoint of humiliation and anger. It had grown into something much bigger. The press coverage, the internal documents from Amelia, and Linda Parker's escalating attempts to discredit her all painted a picture of an entrenched system of inequality that demanded accountability. Gabrielle knew she couldn't turn away now, no matter how high the stakes climbed. The next morning, Gabrielle stood in her kitchen, sipping coffee as her phone buzzed relentlessly with emails, news alerts, and messages from colleagues. Among them was a new statement from the airline. It read in part, "We are conducting a thorough investigation into the matter and remain committed to providing an inclusive experience for all of our passengers." Gabrielle couldn't help but roll her eyes at the hollow phrasing. It was the kind of statement designed to pacify without taking action. She sat down at the dining table, her laptop open to a blank legal document. This time she wasn't drafting arguments for someone else. This case would be hers. The plan was straightforward: sue the airline for damages and push for reforms that would enforce equal treatment of passengers regardless of their race or background. But just as she began outlining her strategy, a notification popped up on her phone. It was an email from Amelia Carter. Gabrielle opened it, scanning through the contents with increasing alarm. "Gabrielle," Amelia had written, "I found something that might help your case. It's risky for me to share this, but I can't stay silent anymore." Attached are a series of emails from the airline's management. They show directives to prioritize preferred passengers, mostly wealthy, white clients over others. "I thought you should see this." Gabrielle's heart raced as she clicked on the attachment. The emails were damning, filled with coded language that left little doubt about the discriminatory practices at play. Phrases like "focus on the core demographic" and "minimize engagement with non-VIP clientele" jumped off the screen. One line in particular sent a chill down her spine. "Ensure that the VIP lounge reflects the brand's image. Keep the atmosphere exclusive." Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Gabrielle rose to answer, finding Michael Hayes standing on her porch. He held a folder in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. "I figured you'd be up," he said with a small smile, handing her the folder. "Thought you might want to see this before it hits the news." Gabrielle opened the folder to find a transcript of an interview Linda Parker had given to a local news station. In it, Linda portrayed herself as the victim of unfair backlash and accused Gabrielle of exploiting the incident for personal gain. "She's trying to flip the narrative," Michael said, stepping into the house, "claiming that she was just following orders and that you're blowing everything out of proportion." Gabrielle frowned, the weight of the situation settling more heavily on her shoulders. She's deflecting, and the airline is letting her take the fall to protect themselves. "Exactly," Michael agreed, "but it's not going to work. Not with what you have now." He gestured toward her laptop. "Those emails are a smoking gun, Gabrielle. They prove this isn't just about one employee, it's systemic." Gabrielle nodded, her resolve hardening. "We need to get this into court." Later that afternoon, Gabrielle filed the lawsuit, naming both the airline and Linda Parker. The legal complaint detailed not only the incident at the lounge, but also the broader pattern of discrimination revealed by the emails. News of the lawsuit spread quickly, reigniting public debate. The airline's response was swift. They issued another statement, this time blaming the emails on a miscommunication within the company and describing the directives as poorly worded but not indicative of discriminatory intent. Gabrielle knew it was a weak defense, but it was enough to muddy the waters in the eyes of some. That evening, as Gabrielle tucked Lila into bed, her daughter looked up at her with wide, searching eyes. "Mom," Lila said softly, "if I grow up and something like this happens to me again, what would you do?" Gabrielle sat on the edge of the bed, stroking Lila's hair. "I would fight for you," she said, "every single time." Lila hesitated. "But what if you're not there?" Gabrielle's chest tightened. She leaned down, pressing a kiss to Lila's forehead. "Then I'll make sure you know how to fight for yourself. And I'll make sure the world is a little better for you by then." Lila nodded, her small hand reaching for Gabrielle's. "You'll win, right?" Gabrielle smiled, though the weight of uncertainty lingered in her heart. "I'll do everything I can," she promised. As Lila drifted off to sleep, Gabrielle returned to her laptop. The lawsuit was just the beginning, and she knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But for her daughter, and for everyone else who had been made to feel unwelcome, lesser, or invisible, Gabrielle was ready to keep fighting. The courtroom was tense, the kind of silence that felt thick and alive, as Gabrielle stood before the judge. The documents she had painstakingly compiled, emails from the airline's internal communications, were neatly stacked in front of her. Gabrielle adjusted her glasses and began her presentation. "These documents," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "are not just emails. They are evidence of a deliberate, systemic policy designed to discriminate against passengers based on race, class, and perceived status. This is not an accident. This is a choice." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads. A lawyer representing the airline rose from his seat, objecting that Gabrielle's claims were speculative, but the judge allowed her to continue. Gabrielle flipped to a specific email on the projector, highlighting the sentence, "Ensure the VIP lounge remains aligned with the brand's image. Filter access appropriately." "This language," Gabrielle said, turning to the courtroom, "is a thinly veiled directive to exclude passengers who don't fit a specific profile. And we all know what that profile is." The ripple of murmurs grew louder, and the airline's legal team exchanged uneasy glances. Gabrielle knew she had struck a nerve. The fallout was immediate. News outlets picked up on the story within hours, flooding social media and headlines with phrases like "airline discrimination scandal" and "Gabrielle Turner exposes systemic bias." The public demanded answers, and the airline, scrambling to save face, announced that Linda Parker's contract had been terminated. Gabrielle expected relief, but when she saw Linda's name trending online with hashtags labeling her as a scapegoat, she couldn't help but feel uneasy. A day later, Linda Parker herself appeared on a local news station. Her face was tight, her voice sharp as she addressed the camera. "I was fired without cause," she said. "The airline is using me to distract from their own wrongdoing. But let me be clear, I wasn't acting alone. I was following orders that came from the top." Gabrielle watched the broadcast with a mix of shock and vindication. Linda went on to reveal that she had kept copies of internal memos and notes from meetings where management explicitly discussed prioritizing wealthy, predominantly white passengers. "I didn't say anything before because I needed this job," Linda said. "But now, I'm done being their scapegoat." The revelations sent shockwaves through the industry. Gabrielle's case was no longer just a single incident. It was a firestorm exposing the underbelly of discriminatory practices across the board. Amelia Carter, meanwhile, found herself at a crossroads. She had been called into a meeting with her superiors, where they strongly implied that her continued employment depended on her silence. Amelia, who had worked for the airline for 15 years, was torn between loyalty to her job and the growing conviction that she couldn't let this go unchallenged. That night, she called Gabrielle. "I want to testify," Amelia said, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't sit back and watch this happen anymore. But I need to know, if they fire me, if I lose everything I've worked for, will it even matter?" Gabrielle didn't hesitate. It will matter, Amelia. And if they fire you, I'll make sure you're taken care of. You're not in this alone. Amelia sighed, the weight of her decision evident even through the phone. Okay, I'm in. I'll do it. The next day, Amelia appeared at the courthouse, her hands shaking slightly as she took the stand. Gabrielle watched her carefully, silently willing her to find the strength she needed. Amelia began her testimony hesitantly, but grew more confident with each word. She detailed the culture within the airline, the unwritten rules that dictated how staff were expected to treat certain passengers differently. They don't say it outright, Amelia said, but it's there. You learn quickly who they value and who they don't, and if you don't follow along, you risk losing everything. Her testimony was powerful, and Gabrielle could see its impact on the faces of the jury. But as Amelia stepped down from the stand, Gabrielle knew this wasn't the end of the fight. Outside the courtroom, a crowd of reporters awaited Gabrielle. Their questions came rapid fire, demanding her reaction to Linda's statements, Amelia's testimony, and the airline's latest attempt to minimize the damage by announcing a new diversity initiative. It's not enough, Gabrielle said firmly, addressing the cameras. This isn't about PR or damage control. This is about accountability. And I won't stop until there's real, systemic change. But behind closed doors, Gabrielle was starting to feel the pressure. Colleagues from her law firm expressed concern about how her high-profile case might impact their other clients. Some even suggested she should accept a settlement to avoid alienating powerful corporate interests. That night, as Gabrielle sat at her desk, poring over documents, Lila walked into the room. "Mom," Lila said, her voice soft. Gabrielle looked up, pushing her glasses to the top of her head. "What is it, sweetheart?" Lila hesitated, then climbed into her mother's lap. "Are you going to win?" Gabrielle wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her close. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm going to try." Lila tilted her head, looking up at her. "Why do they make it so hard?" Gabrielle smiled sadly. "Because change is hard, but that's why we have to keep fighting." As Lila drifted off to sleep in her arms, Gabrielle stared out the window, the city lights blinking in the distance. The fight was far from over, but she was more determined than ever to see it through. Gabrielle sat in the corner of her office, staring at the email on her laptop. It had arrived that morning, sent by one of the largest law firms in the country. Their proposal was simple. They would back her case, providing the legal resources and media expertise needed to win, but only if she agreed to accept a private settlement with the airline. The offer was tempting. Gabrielle couldn't deny the mounting pressure, both financially and emotionally. The case had drawn attention far beyond what she'd anticipated, and every step forward seemed to bring new obstacles. Most troubling of all was the subtle but undeniable toll it was taking on Lila. Her daughter had always been a resilient, bright child, but in recent weeks, Gabrielle noticed the small cracks, hesitation when speaking, nervous glances when they were out in public. Lila's innocence was being chipped away by the harsh realities of the world, and Gabrielle blamed herself for exposing her to it. The law firm's offer would mean an end to the relentless scrutiny, a way to shield Lila from further harm. But it would also mean compromising her principles. Accepting the settlement would bury the case, preventing the systemic issues from being addressed publicly. Gabrielle closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. She felt uncertain about the path she had chosen. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone vibrating on the desk. It was an unknown number, but she answered anyway. "Ms. Turner," came the familiar voice of Linda Parker. Gabrielle stiffened, her tone immediately guarded. "What do you want?" Linda hesitated before speaking. "I'm done protecting them," she said finally. "The airline. They threw me under the bus, and I've had enough." Gabrielle's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her voice remained measured. "And what exactly are you planning to do about it?" "I have something they don't want anyone to hear," Linda said, her tone tinged with bitterness. "A recording from a meeting with management. They were explicit about how to handle undesirable passengers. They told us to avoid interacting with them unless absolutely necessary. It's all on tape." Gabrielle's pulse quickened. "You're telling me you have a recording of airline executives giving discriminatory instructions?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Linda replied, "and I'll give it to you. I just want them to suffer the way they made me suffer. Gabrielle was silent for a moment, weighing the implications. If what Linda claimed was true, it could completely shift the case and the public narrative. "Send it to me," Gabrielle said finally. An hour later, Gabrielle sat at her desk, headphones on as she listened to the recording Linda had sent. The voices on the tape were clear, the words chilling. Executives discussed strategies to maintain the lounge's exclusivity and avoid disruptions from lower-tier customers. One voice even joked, "If they can't afford first class, they don't belong here." Gabrielle's hands clenched into fists as she listened, anger boiling just beneath the surface. This was it, the evidence she needed to expose the airline's practices for what they truly were. She immediately called Michael Hayes, who arrived at her office within the hour. Together, they reviewed the recording, their determination growing with each passing second. "This changes everything," Michael said, his voice filled with quiet intensity. "We need to release this." Gabrielle nodded. "But we need to do it carefully. If we just throw it out there, they'll try to spin it." Over the next 2 days, Gabrielle and Michael worked tirelessly to prepare. They coordinated with trusted journalists, ensuring the story would be presented in its full context. When the recording was finally released, it caused an uproar. Headlines exploded across every major news outlet. Airline executives caught on tape promoting discrimination, leaked audio exposes systemic bias in corporate policies, and civil rights attorney Gabrielle Turner's fight gains new momentum. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. Activists organized protests at airports across the country, demanding accountability, not just from the airline, but from the entire industry. Government officials announced an investigation into the airline's practices, putting even more pressure on its executives. Gabrielle watched the coverage unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. She had known the case would be a battle, but she hadn't anticipated just how many people would rally behind her. At home, Lila sat next to her on the couch, watching a news segment about the protests. The little girl's eyes were wide with wonder as she saw the signs people carried, some of which had Gabrielle's name on them. "Mom," Lila said quietly, "they're listening to you." Gabrielle smiled and put an arm around her daughter. "They're listening to all of us," she said. "Are you going to stop them?" Lila asked. "I'm going to try," Gabrielle replied. "But it's not just about stopping them. It's about making things better. For everyone." Lila seemed to think about this for a moment, then nodded. "I want to help," she said simply. Gabrielle kissed the top of her daughter's head, her heart swelling with pride. "You already are, sweetheart. You already are." As the week went on, Gabrielle's determination only grew. The case was no longer just about holding one company accountable. It was about creating a ripple effect, one that would force the entire industry to reevaluate its practices. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Rows of reporters and spectators lined the benches, their attention fixed on the center of the room where Gabrielle Turner stood, calm but resolute. Behind her, a small group of activists held quiet but visible signs, their messages advocating for justice and equality. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a movement. Gabrielle adjusted the microphone in front of her, taking a moment to meet the eyes of the jury. She could feel the weight of the moment, the expectations of everyone watching, both in the room and beyond. Cameras from every major news outlet pointed in her direction, ready to capture every word. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Gabrielle began, her voice steady and clear. "What you're about to hear is not speculation. It's not hearsay. It's the undeniable truth." She held up a small USB drive, the recording Linda Parker had given her. "This recording is proof of a deliberate effort by this airline to discriminate against passengers based on race, class, and perceived status." The courtroom remained silent as the judge nodded for the evidence to be played. Gabrielle pressed a button, and the voices from the airline executives filled the room. "Ensure the lounge reflects exclusivity," one voice said. "Keep it clean, keep it high-end. No disruptions from, let's say, non-priority guests." Another voice added, "If they can't afford to upgrade, they don't belong." Period. The recording ended and the silence was deafening. Gabrielle let the moment sink in before continuing. "This isn't about one employee acting out of line. This is about a culture, a system, that allows and even encourages discrimination, and it's time we hold them accountable." Across the courtroom, the airline's legal team sat stiffly, their lead attorney already preparing to speak. When their turn came, he stood, adjusting his suit as he addressed the jury. While the recording is concerning, he began, it's important to note that the statements made do not represent the policies of the company as a whole. They were the opinions of a few individuals, and the airline has taken immediate action to address these issues, including terminating Ms. Linda Parker. Gabrielle's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. The attorney continued, Ms. Turner wants you to believe that an entire organization is to blame for the actions of a few. But the truth is, this is an isolated incident, nothing more. The battle lines were drawn. Outside the courtroom, the backlash against Gabrielle began to escalate. A coalition of businesses tied to the airline released a joint statement accusing her of damaging the reputation of the aviation industry and announced a countersuit for defamation. The lawsuit was clearly an intimidation tactic, but it carried real risks. Gabrielle's legal team warned her that the financial implications could be devastating. Things took an even darker turn when Gabrielle received a notification on her phone. Someone had posted an edited video of the original incident, twisting the narrative to make it seem like Gabrielle was the aggressor. The comments were worse. Vicious attacks not only on her, but on Lila as well. That evening, Gabrielle found Lila sitting on the couch, clutching her sketchbook tightly. "Mom," she said softly, "why are people so mean? I didn't do anything wrong." Gabrielle knelt down beside her, her heart breaking. "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart," she said. "Sometimes when people are afraid of change, they try to hurt the ones who are making it happen. But that doesn't mean we stop." Lila looked up at her, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't want you to get hurt, Mom." Gabrielle hugged her tightly. "I'll be okay, and so will you. We're stronger than they think." The next day in court, the case took an unexpected turn. Amelia Carter, who had already testified about her experiences, returned to the stand with new evidence. She held up a folder, her hands trembling slightly as she addressed the court. "These are internal documents from the airline," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "They show years of complaints from employees and passengers about discriminatory practices. Most of them were ignored or buried." Gabrielle's eyes widened as she looked through the documents. They detailed everything from biased hiring practices to the systematic exclusion of certain passengers from premium services. The evidence was damning. The judge ordered the documents to be entered into evidence, and the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Gabrielle knew this was a turning point. That evening, Michael Hayes appeared on a major news program, holding a copy of the documents Amelia had provided. "This case isn't just about one airline," he told the host. "It's about an industry-wide problem that's been ignored for too long. Gabrielle Turner's fight is shedding light on something much bigger." The segment went viral, drawing support from civil rights organizations, activists, and even politicians. The pressure on the airline intensified, with protests erupting at airports across the country. As Gabrielle prepared for the next day in court, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The threats and challenges were still there, but so was the support of a growing movement. Lila came into her office, holding up a new drawing. It showed Gabrielle standing tall with a group of people behind her, holding signs that read justice and equality. "Is this what you see, sweetheart?" Gabrielle asked, smiling softly. Lila nodded. "It's what you're doing, Mom. You're helping everyone." Gabrielle pulled her daughter into a hug, her resolve stronger than ever. This was no longer just her fight. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than, and she wasn't going to stop. The courtroom was charged with tension as Gabrielle returned to the stand, her presence calm yet commanding. Across from her, the airline's legal team whispered among themselves, their strategies shifting as the trial gained momentum. Gabrielle had anticipated their next move, but when it came, it was more ruthless than she expected. The lead attorney for the airline stood, clearing his throat before addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, while Ms. Turner paints herself as a hero fighting for justice, we must consider her motives. This is not just about a single incident. This is about a woman using a personal grievance to propel her career." Gabrielle's jaw tightened, but she remained silent, her hands folded neatly on the stand. The attorney continued, producing a stack of documents. "We've uncovered a history of self-promotion, public speeches, interviews, book deals, all centered around Ms. Turner's legal battles. It seems clear she thrives on controversy. The jury shifted in their seats, and Gabrielle could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her. The attorney's words hung heavy in the air, designed to sow doubt about her intentions. But before Gabrielle could respond, a voice broke the silence. "That's enough." The room turned as Linda Parker stood from the gallery, her expression resolute. She walked to the front, addressing the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to testify." Gabrielle blinked, momentarily stunned. Linda's appearance in court was unexpected, and for her to willingly take the stand was a twist Gabrielle hadn't foreseen. The judge nodded, allowing Linda to be sworn in. As she sat, Linda's gaze swept the room, settling briefly on Gabrielle before she spoke. "I've made mistakes," Linda began, her voice steady but tinged with regret. "Big ones. And I've hurt people, including Miss Turner and her daughter. But I need to make this clear. What happened wasn't just me. It's bigger than that." Linda went on to describe the culture within the airline, detailing how employees were trained to prioritize certain passengers while subtly discouraging interactions with others. "We were told to maintain an image," she said, her voice cracking, "an exclusive image. And if that meant ignoring people who didn't fit that image, so be it." The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Linda took a deep breath, looking directly at Gabrielle. "I'm sorry," she said, "not just for what I did, but for being part of a system that allowed it to happen." Gabrielle's chest tightened, her emotions warring between vindication and the unexpected vulnerability in Linda's apology. When it was her turn to speak, Gabrielle stood, addressing both the jury and the crowd. "This case isn't just about my daughter or me," she began, her voice filled with conviction. "It's about every person who's ever been made to feel less than, who's ever been told they don't belong because of who they are." She paused, glancing at Lila, who sat in the gallery, her small frame dwarfed by the massive courtroom bench. "When this happened, my daughter asked me why they treated her that way. She asked me if she had done something wrong, and I had to look her in the eye and tell her no, it wasn't her fault. But the truth is, I couldn't give her the answer she deserved, because the answer is ugly. The answer is a system that values profit over people." Her voice rose, filled with the emotion she had held back for so long. "This case isn't just about changing one company. It's about changing a mindset, a system that allows discrimination to flourish. And I won't stop until that change happens." The courtroom erupted into applause, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Gabrielle returned to her seat, her heart pounding but her resolve stronger than ever. Outside, the public's response was immediate. Protesters gathered at airports nationwide, their signs calling for justice and reform. Online, hashtags supporting Gabrielle's fight trended globally, with countless people sharing their own experiences of discrimination. Gabrielle sat in the quiet of her office, staring at the settlement offer that had arrived in her inbox. The sum was staggering, enough to ensure financial stability for her and Lila for years to come. But the conditions were clear. Drop the case, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and agree to a private resolution. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. The temptation to accept was undeniable. The months of public scrutiny, legal battles, and personal attacks had taken their toll. Her colleagues had warned her about the risks of continuing, and the safety of her daughter weighed heavily on her mind. But as Gabrielle thought of Lila, how her daughter's innocence had been tainted by this experience, she knew she couldn't take the easy way out. Accepting the settlement wouldn't bring justice. It would only silence the truth. The sound of her phone buzzing broke her thoughts. It was Linda Parker. Gabrielle hesitated before answering. "Ms. Turner," Linda began, her tone hesitant, almost apologetic. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I need to say something." Gabrielle's grip on the phone tightened. "Go on." "I've been talking to the investigators," Linda admitted. "I've told them everything about the meetings, the policies, the unwritten rules. I know I've done terrible things and I know I can't undo them, but I want to make it right. If you'll let me, I'll testify against the airline. Whatever you need, I'll do it." Gabrielle was silent for a moment, processing Linda's words. "Why now?" she finally asked. "Because I'm tired," Linda said, her voice cracking. "Tired of being used, tired of being blamed for something I didn't create. And because you were right, this isn't just about me or you. It's about something bigger. Gabrielle nodded, even though Linda couldn't see her. All right, she said, but if you're going to do this, you need to be honest. No more hiding. I understand, Linda replied quietly. The next day, Gabrielle arrived at the courthouse, her decision made. During the proceedings, the airline's legal team reiterated their settlement offer, sweetening the deal with additional incentives. Gabrielle stood, addressing the court with unwavering resolve. I decline the offer, she announced, her voice firm. This isn't about money, it's about accountability. I won't settle for anything less than systemic change and a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Gas echoed through the courtroom, followed by murmurs from the spectators. The airline's attorneys exchanged looks of frustration, clearly unprepared for Gabrielle's refusal. As the trial continued, Linda took the stand. She described in detail the internal culture of the airline, exposing the subtle and overt ways discrimination was embedded in its operations. I was part of it, Linda admitted, her voice heavy with guilt. I went along with it because I thought I didn't have a choice. But I did, and I made the wrong one. Her testimony was a turning point. It validated everything Gabrielle had fought to prove and forced the airline's leadership to confront their culpability. Outside the courtroom, the public's response was overwhelming. Crowds gathered in support, holding signs that read, "Justice for all passengers" and "Accountability now." Social media buzzed with calls for reform, and several other airlines announced their own internal reviews in response to the growing pressure. In the final days of the trial, the airline capitulated. They agreed to Gabrielle's demands: a public apology, mandatory training for all employees on anti-discrimination policies, and the creation of an independent oversight committee to monitor their practices. Gabrielle stood on the courthouse steps as reporters crowded around her, microphones thrust forward. She spoke calmly, her voice carrying the weight of months of struggle. This victory isn't just mine, she said. It belongs to everyone who has ever been made to feel like they didn't belong, like they weren't good enough. And it's a reminder that when we stand together, we can create real change. As the crowd erupted in applause, Gabrielle spotted Lila at the edge of the throng, holding a small sign she had made herself. It read, "My mom is a hero." Later that evening, Gabrielle sat with Lila at their kitchen table, the tension of the past months finally beginning to lift. Lila looked up at her eyes full of curiosity. "Mom," she asked, "are you going to forgive her?" Gabrielle paused, considering the question. She thought of Linda, her mistakes, her pain, and her attempts to make amends. "I think forgiveness is important," she said carefully, "but it's not something that happens overnight. It's something people have to earn." Lila nodded, her small hand resting on Gabrielle's. "I think she's trying." Gabrielle smiled softly. "I think so too." The victory was bittersweet, but it was a step forward, a step toward a future where Lila and others like her wouldn't have to ask why they were treated differently. The courtroom was unusually still as Gabrielle Turner rose from her seat. The anticipation in the air was palpable, with every eye in the room fixed on her. Reporters clutched their notepads, attorneys leaned forward at their tables, and spectators barely dared to breathe. Gabrielle adjusted the microphone before her gaze sweeping the room before resting on Linda Parker, who sat at the defendant's table. Linda's face was pale, her hands folded tightly on the table as if she were bracing herself. "I want to address something important today," Gabrielle began, her voice calm but deliberate. "For months, this case has been about accountability, about exposing systems and practices that harm people who are simply trying to exist, to belong. And it still is." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But accountability isn't just about punishment. It's also about growth, about giving people the opportunity to change. And that's why I've decided to forgive Linda Parker." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Some gasped audibly. Others exchanged puzzled looks. The reporters furiously scribbled notes, their pens racing to capture Gabrielle's words. Gabrielle raised her hand to quiet the room. "This isn't about excusing what she did," she clarified. "Her actions hurt my daughter, and they perpetuated a culture that devalues people like me, people like Lila. But I also believe that people can learn. They can grow. And Linda has shown me that she's willing to do both." Linda's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Tears welled up, and she quickly wiped them away, looking down at her lap. Gabrielle turned back to the jury. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean ignoring what happened. It means choosing to believe in the possibility of something better. For all of us. And that's what I'm doing today. The room fell silent, the weight of Gabrielle's words sinking in. When the judge called for a brief recess, the courtroom buzzed with activity. Reporters crowded around, microphones in hand, asking for Gabrielle's comment on her decision. Outside, the public reaction was divided. Some praised her for taking the high road, while others criticized her for being too soft on someone who had caused so much harm. Later that afternoon, the airline issued a public statement. Gabrielle and Lila watched from their living room as the CEO appeared on screen, standing at a podium. On behalf of the airline, I want to extend our sincerest apologies to Ms. Turner, her daughter, and every passenger who has ever felt marginalized or mistreated by our policies or actions, he said. His tone was formal, but there was an undercurrent of urgency, as though he was desperate to repair the airline's image. We recognize that changes must be made, and we are committed to doing better. Effective immediately, we will be implementing mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees and establishing an independent oversight committee to ensure accountability moving forward. Gabrielle muted the television, turning to Lila, who was drawing in her sketchbook. What do you think, sweetheart? Lila shrugged. It's good they said sorry. But will they really change? Gabrielle smiled softly, tucking a curl behind Lila's ear. That's what we're going to make sure of. The following week, the court delivered its verdict. The airline was ordered to pay significant damages to Gabrielle and other affected passengers. But more importantly, the court mandated sweeping reforms, new policies to ensure equitable treatment, oversight to monitor compliance, and strict penalties for any future violations. As the judge announced the decision, Gabrielle felt a wave of relief wash over her. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a step toward systemic change. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for all" and "Accountability matters." Gabrielle stepped up to the podium, addressing the sea of faces. This verdict is a win, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Not just for me, not just for Lila, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. This is proof that when we stand up, when we fight for what's right, we can make a difference. The crowd erupted into cheers, the sound echoing down the courthouse steps. Gabrielle felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Michael Hayes. You did it, he said, his voice filled with pride. We did it, Gabrielle corrected, smiling. A few days later, Gabrielle received a letter from the Federal Aviation Administration. They were forming a new committee to oversee fairness and equity in airline practices, and they wanted her to join. It was an opportunity to expand her work to ensure lasting change in the industry. That evening, as Gabrielle prepared dinner, Lila sat at the table coloring. Mom, she asked, looking up, does this mean no one will ever be treated like that again? Gabrielle set down the knife she was holding, kneeling beside her daughter. It means we're making it harder for people to get away with it, she said. But there's still work to do. Lila nodded thoughtfully, then smiled. I want to help. Gabrielle chuckled, pulling Lila into a hug. You already are. The victory felt monumental, but Gabrielle knew it was just the beginning. The journey ahead would be long, but she was ready, and she wouldn't be walking it alone. The sound of the front door closing behind them echoed softly through the house as Gabrielle and Lila stepped inside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The stillness of home felt foreign after the relentless noise of courtrooms, protests, and news conferences. Gabrielle placed her keys on the table, letting out a long breath as Lila quietly slipped off her shoes. The weight of the past months pressed heavily on Gabrielle's shoulders. The case was over, the verdict delivered, and the battle won. But the toll it had taken on them was undeniable. As Gabrielle looked at her daughter, she could see the subtle changes. Lila no longer carried the carefree innocence she once had. Instead, there was a quiet strength in her eyes, a depth of understanding that belied her young age. Mom, Lila said softly, breaking the silence, do you think it's really over? Gabrielle knelt down in front of her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The hard part might be over, but the work isn't. What we did was just the beginning. There's still so much more to fix. Lila nodded, her small hands fiddling with the edge of her shirt. It was hard, wasn't it? It was, Gabrielle admitted, pulling her daughter into a hug. But some things are worth fighting for. The next morning, Gabrielle received a message from Amelia Carter. It was short and to the point. "I've been fired, but thank you for everything." Gabrielle immediately called her back, and Amelia picked up on the first ring. "They let me go," Amelia said without preamble. Her voice was steady, but there was a hint of bitterness beneath it. "Said they couldn't trust me anymore after I testified." "I'm so sorry, Amelia," Gabrielle said, her heart sinking. "You didn't deserve this." "It's all right," Amelia replied. "Honestly, it's a relief. I've spent years keeping my head down, doing what they wanted, and pretending it didn't bother me. Testifying was the first time I felt like I was doing something that mattered, and I have you to thank for that." Gabrielle smiled, though her chest ached with sympathy. "What's next for you?" "Actually, I already have an offer," Amelia said, her tone brightening. "A nonprofit reached out. They help people who speak out against workplace injustice. They want me to join their team." "That's perfect for you," Gabrielle said, genuinely pleased. Amelia hesitated. "Gabrielle, thank you for standing up, for showing me it's okay to fight back." They said their goodbyes, and Gabrielle felt a sense of pride. Amelia's courage had cost her, but it had also opened a new chapter in her life, one where she could be part of the solution. Meanwhile, Linda Parker's life had taken a dramatic turn. After the trial, she had been sentenced to a modest fine and mandatory community service. But the real punishment came in the form of public scrutiny. Former colleagues and passengers shared their stories, painting a picture of someone who had often acted as an enforcer for the airline's discriminatory practices. Linda, however, seemed determined to change. She enrolled in a local program on diversity and inclusion, attending weekly workshops on racial bias and equity. In interviews with local reporters, she spoke candidly about her mistakes and her desire to make amends. "It's not enough to just say I'm sorry," Linda admitted in one interview. "I need to show it through my actions." The airline, under intense public pressure, faced a wave of lawsuits from other passengers who came forward with similar stories of discrimination. The company was forced to overhaul its policies entirely, implementing strict oversight measures and training programs. Industry analysts called it the beginning of a much-needed reckoning within the aviation sector. A few days later, Gabrielle took Lila to the park near their home. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where the air felt light and full of possibility. They sat together on a weathered bench, watching as children played on the swings and dogs chased frisbees across the grass. Lila looked up from her sketchbook, where she had been drawing a picture of the park. "Mom?" she said. "Yes, sweetheart." Lila hesitated, then smiled. "I want to grow up to be like you. You made the world better." Gabrielle felt her throat tighten with emotion. She reached over, pulling Lila close. "You already make the world better just by being in it," she said softly. For the first time in months, Gabrielle felt a sense of peace. The fight had been long and grueling, but it had been worth it, not just for the tangible changes they had achieved, but for the lessons Lila had learned along the way. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the park in a warm golden glow, Gabrielle found herself thinking not of the struggles they had endured, but of the future they had helped shape. A future where Lila, and so many others, could grow up in a world that was just a little more just. The conference hall buzzed with activity. Rows of banners hung from the ceiling, emblazoned with slogans like "Equity in the Skies" and "Building a Better Tomorrow." Gabrielle stood backstage, glancing down at the program in her hand. Her name was printed in bold letters beneath the title of her keynote speech. She exhaled deeply, steadying herself. It had been 6 months since the court case ended, and Gabrielle's life had taken on a new rhythm, one filled with speaking engagements, advocacy work, and her latest role on the Federal Aviation Reform Committee. It was exhausting, but it was also fulfilling in ways she hadn't anticipated. "5 minutes, Miss Turner," a coordinator said, giving her a polite nod. Gabrielle nodded back, adjusting the microphone clip to her blazer. She took a moment to glance at her phone, where a picture of Lila grinned back at her from the lock screen. It was a photo of Lila standing in front of her latest painting, one that had quickly become Gabrielle's favorite. The painting depicted Gabrielle standing tall under a bright blue sky. Around her were swirling golden rays of light, and above her head, Lila had written, "Mom is my hero. She is my light." The memory of Lila presenting the painting to her was still fresh in Gabrielle's mind. "Do you like it?" Lila had asked nervously, holding her hands behind her back. Gabrielle had crouched down, pulling her daughter into a hug. "I love it," she had whispered. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." That painting now hung in Gabrielle's office, a daily reminder of why she continued to fight. The sound of applause brought Gabrielle back to the present. The speaker before her had finished, and it was her turn. She stepped onto the stage, greeted by a standing ovation. "Thank you," Gabrielle began, her voice carrying through the large hall. "Thank you for being here today and for believing that change is possible." She paused, scanning the audience. "When I first started this journey, it was about one thing: justice for my daughter. What I didn't realize was how many others had been waiting for someone to speak up, for someone to say, 'This isn't right and we won't stand for it anymore.'" Gabrielle went on to talk about the changes that had been implemented since the trial: new policies, mandatory training, and an oversight committee that she was proud to be a part of. But she also acknowledged the work that still needed to be done. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's just the beginning. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without effort. But I truly believe that every single one of us has the power to make a difference. You don't have to be a lawyer or a politician or someone with a platform. All you have to do is stand up when you see something wrong. Speak out, because when we do, together, we're unstoppable." The audience erupted into applause once more, and Gabrielle felt a surge of gratitude. Later, as the event wound down, Gabrielle mingled with attendees, exchanging stories and hearing about the impact her fight had on others. Amelia Carter was there, now thriving in her role at the nonprofit, and Michael Hayes was by her side, scribbling notes for what he hinted might become a book. "Gabrielle," Amelia said, smiling warmly, "you've inspired so many people, including me. I can't thank you enough." Gabrielle placed a hand on Amelia's shoulder. "You stood up when it mattered most. That takes courage. You inspired me too." As the night came to an end, Gabrielle returned home with Lila, feeling a rare sense of peace. But as she went through the mail, one envelope caught her attention. It was plain and unmarked, with no return address. She opened it cautiously, her brow furrowing as she read the single sheet of paper inside. The message was short but chilling. "Your fight isn't over. We're watching." Gabrielle set the letter down, her pulse steady. She had faced threats before, and she knew they wouldn't stop now. But instead of fear, she felt determination. "This is just the beginning," she murmured to herself, a small smile playing on her lips. "Mom, are you ready?" Lila called from the hallway. Gabrielle looked up to see her daughter standing by the door, her hand outstretched. "Yes," Gabrielle said, taking Lila's hand. "I'm ready." If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, we invite you to join our community by subscribing to our channel. Let's continue exploring stories of resilience, justice, and hope together. Your voice matters, and your next favorite story is just a click away.